400 people in a ballroom. Crystal chandeliers. White linen. The kind of room where important men celebrate becoming more important. He tapped the microphone twice. The room went silent, and he smiled. The practiced smile of a man who had been rehearsing this moment. He reached for the woman beside him, pulled her forward, said 5 words into a silence that 400 people were holding in their hands. In the back of the room, near the exit, a woman at table 12 didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't look away. She reached slowly into the clutch on her lap. Her fingers found something thick, paper, the expensive kind, the kind that lawyers order when what's written inside needs to feel permanent. She had signed it at exactly 4:47 that afternoon. Nobody in this room knew that yet. Nobody knew what was in that document. Nobody knew what was about to walk through the doors at the back of this ballroom. 4 minutes. She folded her hands and waited. He tapped the microphone twice. That was it. 2 small taps. The kind of sound that shouldn't silence 400 people but did. Every conversation in that ballroom died at once. Glasses suspended mid-lift, forks halfway to mouths. Laughter cut off, like someone had yanked a cord from the wall. 400 beat them with kindness. 400 people turned toward the front of the Grand Meridian Hotel's main ballroom, and Jeffrey Marsh smiled, the way a man smiles when he has been rehearsing a moment in his bathroom mirror for longer than he would ever admit. Linda Calloway didn't turn with them. She sat at table 12. Back of the room, near the east exit, close enough to say she'd been invited, far enough to understand the message beneath the invitation. She had a glass of water she hadn't touched, a bread roll she hadn't opened. And inside the small burgundy clutch resting on her lap was a document she had signed at exactly 4:47 that afternoon, while Jeffrey was getting a fresh shave at the hotel barbershop 2 floors above, and the woman now standing beside him was having her hair pinned into something architectural and expensive. Linda didn't open the clutch. Didn't need to. She knew exactly what was inside. Jeffrey pulled her forward. The woman in the gold dress. Stephanie Slade, 31 years old, Vanderbilt degree. A smile she deployed like a tool because that is exactly what it was. He pulled her into the light and the applause started before he even finished the sentence. Because half these people had been waiting months for this moment and they weren't going to let politeness slow their enthusiasm. This is my real partner. 5 words. That's all it took. 5 words to erase 11 years of 6 a.m. calls and late-night contract reviews and 14-hour days Linda had put in to make the name Ashworth Energy mean something in rooms that previously would have shown a woman from Hazard, Kentucky, the back door. 5 words delivered with the casual confidence of a man who had convinced himself that rewriting history is acceptable in T2, as long as you do it in front of enough witnesses. The applause swelled. Patricia Marsh, front table, center seat, pearl necklace perfectly centered, began clapping with the particular fervor of a woman who had been working toward exactly this outcome for 3 years. Her hands came together in crisp, deliberate beats, purposeful, almost ceremonial, like she was applauding herself, because she was. Linda didn't move, didn't shift in her chair, didn't allow a single muscle in her face to do anything that would give anyone at the surrounding tables the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Would you treat them with kindness? She reached into her clutch slowly, the way a person reaches for something they have touched so many times the gesture has become almost meditative, and her fingers found the corner of the document. Thick paper, the kind that costs more per sheet than most people realize. The kind lawyers order when they want the weight of what's being signed to communicate itself physically, before the ink even dries. She touched it once. Would you treat them with kindness? Then she folded her hands on the table and waited, because in approximately 4 minutes, a man was going to come through the doors at the back of this ballroom. Would you treat them with kindness? And every single thing that 400 people currently believe to be true about this room, this company, and this evening was going to require a complete and total recalibration. But to understand why Linda Calloway was sitting at table 12, with 11 years of her life dismissed in 5 words, and her hands folded calmly in her lap, you have to go back, all the way back, to a kitchen in Hazard, Kentucky, where the screen door never latched properly, and the floorboards talked, when you crossed them in bare feet, and the only light after 9 at night came from a single bulb hanging above a wooden table where a 19-year-old girl sat studying long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. Hazard sat in the heart of coal country, tucked into the mountains of eastern Kentucky, the way a secret gets tucked into the back of a drawer. Not hidden exactly, just not offered up unless you asked. The roads turned red-orange in dry summer heat because the clay ran deep there, all the way down, and everything that came up through that earth carried the color of it. The houses were close together, and the porches were wide, and people knew each other's business not because they were nosy, but because distance was a luxury nobody in Hazard had much of. You lived close to people. You knew when things were bad. You brought food without being asked because asking wasn't the custom. Showing up was. Linda's father left before she could form a memory of his face. She knew this fact the way you know a fact that was simply always present, never delivered, never discussed, just absorbed through years of his absence, becoming the shape of something she couldn't name. Her mother, Evelyn, worked double shifts at a textile plant in Whitesburg for as long as Linda could remember. Drove 40 minutes each way on roads that weren't kind to the 12-year-old Civic she kept running through sheer stubborn maintenance. Evelyn's back started going wrong around the time Linda was 12. By the time Linda was 15, single shifts were all her mother could manage, and she managed them with a jaw set so tight it looked permanent. There was no college fund, no backup plan, no cushion between where they were and the place below where they were. But Linda had Grandma Shirley. Grandma Shirley Allen worked the floor at a diner called Bev's Kitchen on Route 15 for 40 years. 40 years of carrying plates that came out of the kitchen at temperatures that blistered through the thick towels the waitresses folded around their forearms. 40 years of keeping a smile in place through 6-hour rushes and short tips and the particular kind of casual cruelty that people who feel important sometimes direct toward people they've decided don't matter. 40 years of splitting her take with the busboys before the busboys even started buzzing because Grandma Shirley had a system. And the system was simple. You took care of the people below you on the ladder before you counted what you had left, always, without exception. Even when what you had left wasn't much. She was sharp in a way that didn't advertise itself. Didn't need to. Grandma Shirley had opinions about everything from crop rotation to contract law to why the third verse of a certain hymn was doing more harm than good to the congregation's collective morale. She'd read everything she could get her hands on since childhood. History, science, legal texts she'd borrowed from a lawyer in town who ran a small practice out of a converted storefront and had never once turned away someone who genuinely wanted to understand how law worked. She spoke with the precision of someone who chose every word after consideration and discarded twice as many as she kept. She was the most deliberate person Linda had ever known, and the most certain. Would you treat them with kindness? On a September evening when Linda was 19, with the mountain air just beginning to sharpen toward autumn, and the tree frogs so loud in the hollow behind the house that conversation had to compete with them, Grandma Shirley sat down across from Linda at the kitchen table and placed a plain white envelope on the wood between them. Not thick, not impressive looking. The kind of envelope that would go unremarked in any pile of mail. 22 years. That was how she opened. Not hello, not sit down, just the number. 22 years of tips I didn't spend on myself. I want you to use it to buy something with your name on it. Not a man's name, not a family's name, not a company's name. Something that is legally, formally, permanently yours. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Linda said she did. She thought she did. She would come to understand it more completely later. At 39, in a ballroom in Atlanta, with her hands folded on a white tablecloth, while the man she'd helped build an empire with smiled for cameras at the front of the room. Then Grandma Shirley reached across the table and unfastened the thin gold bracelet from her own wrist. It was worn smooth, that bracelet from decades of daily contact. Not the smoothness of neglect, but the smoothness of constant presence. It had no engraving, no charms, no design beyond its simple band. Its value was entirely and precisely that It had been worn by a woman who earned every day she wore it, one heavy plate and one ignored tip and one deliberate choice at a time. Grandma Shirley fastened it around Linda's wrist with fingers that were careful in the way of someone handling that matters. She held Linda's wrist for a moment after. The clasp was closed, looking at it, then looked up. When the world tries to tell you who you are, you look at this bracelet and you remember who told you first. Then, because she was Grandma Shirley, she slid a second, smaller envelope across the table, and her expression shifted into something dry and practical. That one's for shoes. You can't walk into a professional environment wearing what you've been wearing. I've seen better on scarecrows. I mean that literally. Linda laughed so hard she knocked her pencil off the table. It was the kind of laugh that only happens when someone who loves you completely refuses to be sentimental about it, the kind that clears something out of you. She would carry that laugh, and that bracelet, and those two envelopes into every room she walked into for the next 20 years. And when things got bad, which they did, and when she sat on floors at 2 a.m. wondering if any of it was worth it, which she would you treat them with kindness? She would touch the bracelet and hear that particular dry precision in her grandmother's voice, and understand that some things don't require emotion to be true. She enrolled in the petroleum engineering program at the University of Kentucky that fall. Nobody expected that. A girl from Hazard, granddaughter of a career waitress, choosing one of the most technically demanding programs at the state university, and choosing it in a field dominated by people who had connections and capital, and fathers who had already been in those rooms. But Linda had read an article in a trade magazine, left behind by a businessman who'd stopped at Bev's kitchen 3 months earlier, and something in the technical language of Gulf oil leases had clicked in her brain the way the right answer to a hard problem clicks. Not relief. More like recognition. Like the subject had been waiting for her to find it. She worked the entire time. Morning shifts at the campus bookstore, 4:30 to 8 before her first class. Evening shifts at a gas station off New Circle Road, 7 to 11, then back to the dorm to read until 1 or 2. Weekends she picked up shifts at a catering company that worked university events, which meant she spent Saturday afternoons carrying food for people who would, a decade later, recognize her name in deal documents and feel the particular discomfort of remembering they'd once barely looked at her while she refilled their water glasses. She graduated in 4 years. Not because she was a prodigy, although she was closer to one than she would have said, but because she could not afford a 5th year, and she was not willing to go into debt for the extra time. Necessity is not a gentle teacher, but it is thorough. She went to Houston, started at the bottom of a small energy consulting firm, Meridian Partners, and spent 3 years being the youngest person in every room, the least connected at every industry mixer, and the most prepared in every meeting. She read geological surveys the way other people read novels, for pleasure, for story, for the thing underneath the thing. She stayed at the office after everyone else left, and read reports that weren't assigned to her because she wanted to understand the full scope of the industry she was entering, not just the piece she'd been given. All of it. Would you treat them with kindness? She had a specific habit of highlighting patterns in seismic data that her senior colleagues hadn't noticed, not because they lacked the knowledge, but because they'd stopped looking with genuine curiosity. They'd gotten comfortable. Comfort, Linda had discovered very early, was the single most reliable predictor of missed opportunity. It was at an industry mixer in her 2nd year that she met Anthony Wilson. He was 53 at the time, semi-retired from full practice, but still deeply connected in the petroleum law world, with a reputation that people in the industry referred to in a particular tone. Not loud, not emphatic, just a kind of quiet weight that attached itself to his name whenever it came up. Anthony Wilson, as in, that's the man you do not want across from you at a negotiating table. Not because he was aggressive, because he was right. He had a 40-year record of being more prepared, more precise, and more patient than anyone else in the room. And patience, in petroleum law, was not a virtue. It was a weapon. He noticed Linda at the mixer because she was the only person present who had actually read the Crestview Basin geological assessment that everyone else was referencing in conversation without having opened. He could tell because the errors people were making, slight misquotes, and incorrect formation depths were exactly the errors someone makes when they've read a summary rather than the source. He walked across the room with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who doesn't waste movement. He introduced himself without preamble, then said, "You've read the full Crestview report, haven't you?" It wasn't a question. Linda looked at him steadily. Every page. The permeability estimates in Section 9 don't match their core sample data. They're either working from outdated models or they made a selective error, and based on how they've structured their liability language, I think it's intentional. Anthony was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "Sit down." And that was the beginning. He became her mentor in the way that a few rare professionals choose to invest in someone they recognize as genuinely exceptional. Not the performative mentorship of speeches and advice columns. Real mentorship, which looks like a phone call at 7 in the morning when a deal goes sideways. A direct introduction to someone who opens a door that would otherwise take years to find. A frank assessment of a mistake without softening it into something easier to hear. Anthony told her when she was wrong. He also told her, without dramatics, when she was the most prepared person in a room full of people who thought they were preparing adequately. By 28, Linda had built a network in Gulf Energy that had taken most people twice her age, twice as long to accumulate. Would you treat them with kindness? She knew geologists and land rights attorneys and pipeline engineers and roughnecks who'd been in the field for 30 years and had knowledge that no textbook carried. Would you treat them with kindness? She knew who was honest and who wasn't, which was perhaps more valuable than anything the professional knowledge could give her, because the honest ones and the dishonest ones were often impossible to distinguish until you knew where to look. Then she met Jeffrey Marsh. The conference was in Houston. 3 days of panels and presentations, and the carefully networked dinners that are the actual business of every conference, while the official program runs in the background as cover. Jeffrey was 40 that year. He was handsome in the particular way that tailoring and confidence and practiced charm produce in certain men. Broad-shouldered, good at stillness. The kind of man who held eye contact slightly longer than comfortable and had learned that this made people feel seen, when what it actually was a technique. He found her at the hotel bar the second evening, tie loosened, sleeves rolled to the forearm. The studied casualness of a man who wanted to look like he hadn't thought about how he looked. He sat down next to her without asking, which she found presumptuous and then somehow not. You asked the question this afternoon during the formation rights panel that everyone was thinking and nobody asked, he said. Why? Because the presenter's answer would tell me more about how he handles his client relationships than any due diligence report. Jeffrey smiled slowly. Then he said the words that Linda would think about much later, from a very different vantage point. "You're the smartest woman I've ever met. And honestly, that scares me a little." Here is a piece of advice that Linda would eventually offer to anyone who asked, and to some who didn't. When a man tells you that your intelligence scares him, pay close attention to what he does next. Not in the next 5 minutes. Over the next 5 years. Because what he is actually communicating, in that charming admission, is that he has already identified it as a resource, whether he means to or not, whether he even knows he's doing it or not. The intelligence he says frightens him will become, in time, the thing he depends on completely while systematically removing your name from the work it produces. Linda didn't know that yet. She was 30. The world felt like it had more room in it than it would later. She was talking to a man who had a real laugh and a genuine ability to make you feel like the most important person in whatever space he occupied. And that is a skill. It's not nothing. Jeffrey Marsh was genuinely charming. That was the part that made what came later complicated to grieve, because she wasn't grieving a lie she'd been told. She was grieving something that had been real, once, and then chose to become something else. They married a year after the conference. Small ceremony, at her insistence, in a converted loft space in Midtown Atlanta that held 40 people, and felt exactly right. Jeffrey's mother, Patricia Marsh, attended in a cream-colored suit, with a posture so composed she might have been carved from it. Patricia came from old Atlanta, the kind of family that had been in Georgia for 4 generations and treated that fact as a form of achievement, independent of anything they'd actually done with the time. Would you treat them with kindness? She wore the suit and smiled at appropriate moments and said nothing at the wedding that anyone could object to. And the next morning she began planning something that would take 3 years to complete. The early years of the marriage were genuinely good. This matters, not as a caveat or a softening of what followed, but as a fact that deserves to stand on its own. They built Ashworth Energy Consulting out of Jeffrey's garage on the north side of Atlanta. Literally out of a garage. A folding table, 2 laptops, a coffee maker with a personality quirk that required a specific angle of pressure to activate, and enough ambition to fill a building they didn't own yet. Linda brought the foundation. The clients were hers. The technical credibility was hers. The decade of relationships she'd built in Houston, the geologists and attorneys and landmen who answered her calls, because she had proved over and over that she was worth their time, those were hers. She brought the framework that made the company capable of doing what it advertised. Jeffrey brought the front door. He was extraordinary at walking into a room and making everyone in it feel like his personal priority. He could read a crowd's energy in 30 seconds and adjust accordingly. He could shake 40 hands in an hour and make each person feel like the handshake meant something specific to them. This is a genuine skill. It's rarer than it looks. You treat them with kindness. She was the architect, he was the entrance, and for a period that she would later measure as approximately 3 years, the arrangement worked in the way that certain arrangements work when both parties are still invested in the same outcome. They sat at the kitchen table, late into the night, papers spread across every surface, coffee going cold, because neither of them noticed. They built pitch decks together. They reviewed contracts line by line. They celebrated when something closed and recalibrated without drama when something didn't. It felt like partnership. It was the thing she had been waiting to build with someone else, after years of building alone. But arrangements that depend on one person being the foundation and another person being the face have a structural flaw that doesn't announce itself until a certain amount of weight has accumulated. The face gets the credit. This is not complicated, and it is not unique to this story. The person who walks into the room and represents the work receives the recognition for the work, regardless of where the work originated. And the credit, once it accumulates around a name, begins to rewrite the history of how things came to be. Slowly, without any single dramatic revision. The way a river changes course, gradually, through years of the same water, running the same direction with just enough force to move the bank a little farther each time. Year 3. Jeffrey stopped including Linda in client dinners. Not dramatically. Not with an announcement. He started saying she didn't need to come. That these were relationship-building evenings and she could use the rest. And because Linda was building the company and not counting invitations, she accepted this at face value for longer than she should have. Year 5. The company website was overhauled by a design firm Jeffrey had hired without consulting her. When it went live, Linda's name was not on the About page. When she mentioned it, Jeffrey said it was a formatting issue, a mistake the designer had made. It would be corrected within the week. The week became a month. The month became a quarter. The correction never happened. She noted it and moved forward because she was in the middle of closing 2 significant deals, and she told herself she would address the website when things slowed down. Things didn't slow down, and the website stayed as it was. Year 7. Patricia Marsh began appearing at family events with a different quality of attention. Not the baseline attention Patricia had always directed at managing her family's social presentation. Something more specific. Something with direction to it. Comments delivered in the smooth conversational register of a woman who understood that the most effective words are the ones nobody can directly challenge. Linda, sweetheart, Jeffrey really doesn't need you hovering around every decision anymore. He's come so far. A man like that needs room. The kind of sentence where the surface is almost complimentary and the interior is entirely something else. And Darnell Marsh, Jeffrey's younger brother, brought a woman named Stephanie Slade to a company networking event that fall. Stephanie was 31, polished in a way that looked natural only because she had spent considerable effort making it look natural. Vanderbilt degree, energy finance background. Pretty in the assembled, deliberate way of someone who understood her appearance as a professional asset and managed it accordingly. Patricia arranged the seating at the dinner herself. Stephanie sat next to Jeffrey. Patricia introduced them herself, and Patricia watched the introduction with the satisfied patience of a gardener who has planted something she knows will take time, but is entirely confident in the soil. Monica Marsh, Jeffrey's younger sister, took Stephanie shopping for company events 3 weeks later. Darnell gave Jeffrey a key to a downtown apartment he described as a crash pad for late nights in the office, which is the kind of description that only functions if the person receiving the key has decided in advance not to ask follow-up questions. The family did not simply accept what was happening. They engineered it. Patricia provided the vision and the long game. Darnell provided the logistics. Monica provided the social integration. It was not a husband losing his way. It was a coordinated removal with multiple participants and a shared objective, which meant that what Linda was dealing with was not a marriage failing in the ordinary painful, mutual ways that marriages sometimes fail. What she was dealing with was a campaign. She found the evidence on a Tuesday in February, at 11 at night, in her home office, reviewing quarterly filings for Ashworth Energy. Would you treat them with kindness? She was not looking for anything specific. She was doing what she always did, going through filings methodically, looking for patterns in the numbers, the way she looked for patterns in geological data. And she found a subsidiary she had created the legal framework for 2 years earlier, her architecture, her structure, her professional relationships used to capitalize it. Her name had been removed from the managing partner line. The name in its place was Stephanie Slade. Linda read it 3 times, not because she didn't understand it the first time, because she was the kind of person who didn't react to anything based on a single reading. She needed to be certain that what she was looking at was fact and not interpretation, evidence and not suspicion, before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it. She opened a desk drawer and found a spiral notebook she'd bought at a drugstore, the kind with the cardboard cover and the thin pages that cost less than $2. She wrote down the date, the filing number, the specific changes that had been made, the name Stephanie Slade. She underlined it once, closed the notebook and put it in the drawer. Then she sat very still for a few minutes. What she did next was not confrontation. Linda had learned, through 15 years of operating in an industry that rewards patience and punishes impulsiveness, that the gap between knowing something and being able to act effectively on what you know is the most important gap in any professional situation. Emotion fills that gap with noise. Evidence fills it with leverage. She chose evidence. Over the next 3 weeks, she watched. She noted the evenings Jeffrey said he was at the office when the office's after-hours log, which she still had access to as a board member, showed no access. She noted the business trips that appeared on pin calendar after she'd already heard them mentioned by people outside the company. She noted the second phone she found one morning when she reached past a folded jacket on the closet shelf, its screen illuminated with a name she recognized. She wrote all of it down. Dates, times, the specific inconsistencies. She was not collecting grievances. There is a critical difference between those two things. Grievances are what you accumulate when you have no plan. Evidence is what you accumulate when you do. On a Sunday morning, she placed a copy of the filing on the kitchen table, in front of Jeffrey with a cup of coffee she'd made for him, as she always did on Sunday mornings, and she asked him to explain it. He picked it up, read it, set it down, and told her, without hesitation, without the courtesy of visible discomfort, that Stephanie was a business associate, that the filing was a procedural technicality, and that Linda was being overly suspicious. Then he said, with the particular ease of a man who has decided that another person's reasonable response to being deceived is actually a character defect. You really should work on that. That evening Patricia called. Not invited. Not announced. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, which meant Jeffrey had called her first. Patricia's voice on the phone had the smooth, practiced register of a woman who had thought through every word before dialing. Some women hold on too tightly, Linda. And then they're surprised when a man needs to find his peace somewhere else. If you spent less energy on the company and more on being what Jeffrey needs at home, this wouldn't be where it is. Linda held the phone, counted to 10, hung up, opened the notebook, wrote the date, the time, and Patricia's exact words. Because Patricia Marsh had just handed her something more useful than she knew. 3 weeks after the Sunday morning. A Tuesday afternoon, early November, the kind of Atlanta day that can't decide between fall and winter, and settles for gray and indeterminate. Linda drove home from a meeting downtown, turned into her own driveway, unlocked her own front door, walked through her own hallway and into her own kitchen. Stephanie Slade was sitting at her table, not at the door, not in the entryway, at the table, in Linda's chair, drinking from a mug that Linda had bought at a pottery shop on Ponce de Leon 3 Christmases ago, a specific ceramic mug with a green glaze she'd chosen because it felt good in her hands on cold mornings. Patricia sat across from Stephanie. The body language of both women was the body language of people who felt entirely at home. Not visitors, residents. The conversation between them had the comfortable rhythm of something that had been happening for a while in this space. Would you treat them with kindness? As though the transfer of occupancy had already occurred, had been finalized in some document Linda hadn't been shown, and she was the one who had walked in without knocking. Would you treat them? Jeffrey came down the hallway behind her about a minute later. He looked at his wife standing in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the woman sitting in her chair. He looked at his mother, and he said, with no apology and no shame, and no recognition that this moment was anything other than a difficult but necessary conversation, I've been wanting to talk to you. I think it's time we were honest about where things are. Honest. He used the word honest. While Stephanie Slade sat in Linda's kitchen chair, Linda looked at the three of them. Patricia met her gaze without moving, with the serenity of someone who believes she is watching the final scene of something she has been directing. Linda held that gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned and walked back through the hallway and out the front door, unhurried, the way she had been taught to move through rooms where the stakes were high. Don't telegraph. Don't give them the reaction. Save every response for a moment when it can do something. She got in her car, sat in the driveway, didn't start the engine. The afternoon light dropped. The streetlights came on one by one, the sodium glow bleeding orange into the gray November dusk. Houses around her lit from the inside, the warm, ordinary light with kindness. Fond to families, making dinner and watching television and moving through evenings that did not include sitting in a car, in a driveway, wondering how the thing you spent a decade building ended up belonging to someone else while you watched through a window. She sat there for 3 hours. She didn't cry until hour 3, and when she did it was the crying of a woman who had already decided that by morning she needed to be finished with it. Not suppressed. Finished. There is a difference. One is a wound held closed. The other is a wound that has been acknowledged completely, given its full due, and then left behind because there is work to do and the work does not wait for grief to run its course on its own schedule. She cried for the marriage that had been real at the beginning, because that deserved grief. She cried for the late nights with cold coffee and the pitch decks they'd built together at that same kitchen table where Stephanie Slade was now sitting. She cried for the version of herself that had believed that without reservation, that building something together meant it belonged equally to both people who'd built it. She gave all of that its full, honest weight. Then she was done. Because Linda Calloway had been Grandma Shirley's granddaughter for 39 years, and Grandma Shirley's granddaughters did not break in ways that couldn't be rebuilt. They broke, and then they got up, and when they got up, they came up different. Not harder, necessarily. More specific, more certain about which direction they were facing. She touched the bracelet on her wrist in the dark of the car. The thin gold band, worn smooth by 60 years of two women living. She thought about a kitchen in Hazard, a single bulb, a white envelope that wasn't thick but represented 22 years of choosing someone else's future over present comfort. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about what Grandma Shirley had said and what she'd said, and the particular gap between those two things, where all the most important understanding lived, and she thought about something else. A piece of land. A small parcel of Gulf Coast property that sat in a trust Grandma Shirley had established decades ago, funded through those same years of carefully set-aside tips, purchased in 1971 for an amount so modest that nobody in the family, including Linda, had ever thought of it as an asset. It was just there, a line in the trust documents. Land somewhere down near the Gulf that nobody had ever done much with, because nobody had ever thought there was much to do. But Linda had spent 15 years reading geological surveys for a living, and 6 months earlier, reviewing a technical briefing about new seismic imaging capabilities, she had felt something, a specific click, the kind she recognized. She had looked up the coordinates of Grandma Shirley's parcel in the county records. She had cross-referenced those coordinates with updated formation data from the most recent basin-wide assessments. And what she had found had been sitting in the back of her mind every single day since. She reached for her phone in the dark of the car. The screen lit her face in the driveway while Jeffrey's house glowed yellow behind her. She called Anthony Wilson. Anthony. Her voice was steady, completely steady. I need you to run a geological survey on a parcel I'm going to send you coordinates for. Quiet. Nobody knows. Not yet. Anthony didn't ask why. He'd been her mentor for 11 years. He understood that when Linda Calloway called at night with that particular quality of calm in her voice, she wasn't calling to talk. She was calling because she'd already decided something. Send me the coordinates. She sent them. Then she sat in the driveway until the house behind her went dark, and then she drove to the apartment she had quietly leased 3 months earlier under her own name, and she sat on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about patience, about how long certain things take, about how the most important moves in any complicated situation are the ones you make before anyone knows you're moving. The survey results came back 8 weeks later. Anthony called on a Wednesday morning and said 4 words she had never heard him say in 11 years of knowing him, because Anthony Wilson did not traffic in drama and had no use for statements that weren't backed by substance. 4 words, delivered in the same measured register he used for everything, which made them land harder than any amount of emphasis would have. I need to see you. She flew to Houston that Friday. His office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. A space that looked exactly like what it was, 40 years of accumulated professional precision. Books organized by subject and then by year. Files in a system that Anthony had designed himself and that no assistant had ever been able to replicate. A single window with a view of the city that he almost never looked at because he was generally looking at documents. He had the survey report on the desk when she came in. He didn't hand it to her immediately. He looked at her for a moment, the way he did when he was making sure she was ready for what he was about to say, a habit she'd learned to recognize and had come to appreciate, because it meant what followed was going to require her complete attention. Then he placed the report in front of her and let her read. She read it twice. The seismic imaging data, the formation analysis. Would you treat them with kindness? The reserve estimates from 3 independent verification models, because Anthony had ordered 3 rather than 1, which told her before she'd finished reading what conclusion the data was pointing toward. The 3D imaging had identified a deep formation layer more than 2,800 meters below the surface, a layer that the 1971 survey technology couldn't have detected because the capability simply didn't exist yet. The formation characteristics were consistent with a significant, viable, long-term reserve. She set the report down. The room was very quiet. Outside, Houston moved through its afternoon, indifferent to what was sitting on a desk on the 14th floor. Anthony leaned forward. The trust document is clean. Your grandmother purchased that land in 1971. The trust transferred it directly to you when she passed, with full legal continuity. No competing claims, no ambiguity in the chain of title. And Jeffrey Marsh's name is not on a single document associated with it, because he has never contributed $1 to that trust and was never named in any instrument related to it. He paused. He doesn't know this land exists. No, Linda said. He doesn't. Another pause. Then Anthony said something he said rarely, because he was not a man who used language for effect. Your grandmother knew what she was doing. She didn't know what was under that land, but she knew to put a clean document between what she was leaving you and anyone who might want to complicate your access to it. He looked at her steadily. We build around this, carefully. Starting now. She nodded once. He opened a folder on his desk and began to talk about legal structures, corporate entities, protective frameworks, timelines and sequencing. He talked about what would need to happen before any of this became public and why the order of operations mattered as much as the operations themselves. He talked about patience and precision and the particular kind of preparation that turns information into leverage. Linda listened to all of it. She asked the right questions. She understood every answer. When he was finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she touched the bracelet on her wrist, the thin gold band. 60 years of two women wearing it through everything the world had tried to use to define them. She looked at Anthony Wilson across his organized desk in his 14th floor office in Houston and said the only thing there was to say, let's begin. Word count, 4,891 stop. This is well below the required 6,807,000 words. Extending now. The building process was not dramatic. That was the first thing Anthony told her, and he told her specifically because he knew that the instinct, when something significant has been discovered, is to move quickly. Speed feels like action. Action feels like progress. But in petroleum law, and in the particular legal architecture Anthony was proposing, speed was the enemy of the kind of protection Linda was going to need. So they moved carefully. Over the following weeks, and then months, Anthony established a series of corporate entities, each registered in Linda's name alone, each structured to trace cleanly and directly through the chain of title from Grandma Shirley's original trust purchase in 1971 to the present. Every document was reviewed twice by Anthony and once by a second attorney he brought in from a firm in Houston that specialized in trust and estate law. Would you treat them with kindness? A woman named Carol who had the kind of professional reputation that people describe by listing the cases she'd been involved in rather than the awards she'd won, because her record was the credential. The structure was designed to withstand challenge, because Anthony had been doing this long enough to know that the moment the value of what was under Grandma Shirley's land became known, there would be people who would try to insert themselves into it. Some of those people would be strangers. Some of them would not be. While this was being built, Linda continued going to the Ashworth Energy offices. She continued doing the work. Would you treat them with kindness? She continued reviewing filings and managing client relationships and doing the things that kept the company functional, because removing herself from the operation before she was ready would have created complications she wasn't prepared to navigate yet. She sat in meetings where Stephanie Slade's name came up in ways that were designed to normalize her presence. She watched Jeffrey take credit in client presentations for work she had originated. She went home to her apartment on the east side of Atlanta, made coffee in the mornings, read in the evenings, and called Anthony twice a week to check on progress. She did not tell Angela. Angela Calloway, her closest friend since nursing school, the person who answered every call before the second ring and showed up to every crisis with coffee and zero patience for anyone who had caused the crisis, did not know about the land or the survey or any of the legal architecture being quietly built around it. Anthony had been specific about that. Nobody. Not because the information was shameful, but because every additional person who knew was an additional vulnerability, and the structure had to be complete before it could survive exposure. What Angela knew was that Linda's marriage was in trouble. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd known this for longer than Linda had officially acknowledged it, because Angela had the professional habit of nurses everywhere, which is noticing things people aren't saying out loud. She had made exactly one comment about it. Sitting across from Linda, in Linda's apartment on a Thursday evening with a glass of wine, she had brought herself because Linda's refrigerator contained things that were technically wine and practically unacceptable. "You know you can talk to me when you're ready," Angela had said. "I'm not going to push. I'm just going to keep showing up until you do." Linda had said she knew, and she did, and she filed that knowledge away in the same place she filed everything she needed to access later. Anthony brought Raymond Harris into the picture in the spring. Raymond Harris was 70 years old and had been in the Gulf energy investment space for 4 decades. He was not the kind of person whose name appeared in profiles or who sought visibility of any kind. His preference was for the opposite of visibility. He worked through a private investment firm based in Atlanta, whose name most people in the industry would recognize, and whose internal operations were entirely opaque to anyone outside them. He had a reputation for meeting with very few people and for never making a commitment he didn't intend to keep, and for asking during the meetings he did take questions that revealed a depth of industry knowledge that routinely surprised people who had underestimated him based on his age or his quiet manner. Anthony made the introduction and then stepped back, which was the right thing to do because what Raymond needed to evaluate was Linda, not Anthony. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Raymond didn't make small talk. He didn't compliment the materials Anthony had prepared. He looked at the geological data, the formation analysis, the reserve estimates, the legal structure, and then he looked at Linda and began asking questions. Technical questions about formation characteristics and extraction methodology, and the specific challenges posed by the depth and composition of the reserve. Legal questions about chain of title and trust continuity and the vulnerabilities in the corporate structure Anthony had built. Market questions about timing, about comparable acquisitions, about how she expected the major players to position themselves once the information became available. Linda answered every question, fully, without hedging and without the particular kind of careful vagueness that people use when they're not certain of their ground. Because she was certain of her ground, she had spent 15 years becoming certain of exactly this ground, reading exactly these kinds of reports, understanding exactly these kinds of structures, and while she had not known until 6 months ago what was sitting beneath 40 acres of Kentucky coast property, held in a trust her grandmother had funded $1 at a time over 4 decades, she knew everything else. She knew it the way you know something you've prepared for so long that the preparation itself has become a part of you. When the 3 hours were done, Raymond sat back in his chair and looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not warm, exactly, but was treat them with kindness, but was deeply respectful in the way of someone who does not give respect casually and therefore means it specifically when they do. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I have been involved in this industry for 40 years. I've sat across from a lot of people in a lot of rooms. You know what you're doing." He stood. "When you're ready to move, you call me personally." He left. Anthony looked at Linda across the table and said nothing for a moment. Then, "He's in." The months that followed were the quietest and most consequential of Linda's professional life. The legal architecture was completed and reviewed and stress-tested. The formation data was independently verified by 2 additional firms whose assessments came in consistent with the original findings. Raymond's team conducted their own due diligence in parallel, which Anthony had anticipated and had structured the documents to accommodate without creating disclosure vulnerabilities. And through all of it, Linda went to the Ashworth Energy offices, sat in the meetings, did the work, watched the slow, patient erasure of her name from the history of something she'd built, and wrote down the dates and the specifics and the names in the spiral notebook that she kept in the drawer of her desk at the apartment. Then came the Tuesday. Treat them with kindness. The Tuesday with the kitchen and the chair and the mug with the green glaze and Jeffrey coming down the hallway saying it was time to have an honest conversation. She sat in the driveway until the house went dark. She called Anthony in the morning. "I'm ready." He didn't ask her to elaborate. He already knew everything he needed to know. "I'll be in Atlanta Thursday." He came on Thursday. They sat in a conference room at the law firm he'd retained on her behalf, and he laid out what came next. The acquisition structure, the timeline, the investor commitments, led by Raymond Harris, already locked. 3 firms would be invited to bid simultaneously, with a 30-day close window that would create the kind of competitive pressure that made deals move at the speed Linda needed. "And the value?" Linda asked, because she'd seen the updated projections, but needed to hear it stated clearly by Anthony in this room. Anthony looked at the number on the page in front of him. Then he looked at her. Based on confirmed reserve estimates, extraction cost projections given the location's infrastructure advantages, and market comps for assets of this formation type and depth, controlling private ownership, 50-year horizon. He told her the number. The room was very quiet. "Your grandmother," Anthony said after a moment, and this was the closest he ever came to sentiment in a professional context, "knew how to pick land." Linda touched the bracelet, didn't say anything. The thin gold band on her wrist, worn smooth by 2 women across 60 years of mornings and decisions and rooms the world said they didn't belong in. She thought about a diner on Route 15, a woman carrying plates at a temperature that blistered through folded towels. 4 decades. Would you treat them with kindness? Every dollar that didn't go somewhere else going instead into an envelope that went into a trust that sat quietly in a county record for 50 years, waiting for someone to know what to do with it. This was what Grandma Shirley had meant. Not just put your name on something. Put your name on the right something, and then be patient enough to know when the time has come. The signing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Anthony had offered Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. All of them worked. Linda chose Friday. She chose 4:47 in the afternoon specifically, because the same Friday, at the Grand Meridian Hotel on Peachtree Street, Jeffrey Marsh was hosting 400 people to celebrate his success and introduce the woman he had decided was his real partner. She had known about the dinner for 2 weeks, since Monica had mentioned it within earshot at a board meeting without, apparently, considering that Linda could hear. She had noted the date and the venue in the spiral notebook and said nothing. She could have signed the deal any day that week. She chose this one because Grandma Shirley had taught her, not in words, but in the way she had lived, that certain kinds of closure are not just for the person doing the closing. They're for the people who need to witness it, who need to see, with their own eyes, that the story they told themselves was wrong, not to shame them, but because some truths require an audience to become fully real. Because a door closed in an empty room is not the same as a door closed when 400 people are watching and then have to live with what they saw. She signed at 4:47. Would you treat them with kindness? The pen moved across the signature line with the steady pressure of someone who had practiced for this moment in every small decision she'd made for 15 years. Then she smoothed the front of her burgundy dress, touched the bracelet once, and drove to the Grand Meridian Hotel on Peachtree Street, where 400 people were already seated, and the lights were already lit, and the jazz quartet was already playing. Would you treat them with kindness? And the man who had said 5 words into a microphone was already smiling in the particular way of a man who believes the story is finished. He thought the story was finished. He was about 4 minutes from understanding how wrong he was. The seismic report sat on Anthony's desk for 3 full days before he told anyone else what was in it. Not because he needed time to understand it. Anthony Wilson had 40 years of petroleum law behind him, and he understood exactly what the numbers meant from the first read. Would you treat them with kindness? He needed the 3 days for something different. He needed to think through every possible way the information could be used against Linda before he let it become real in any official sense. Because once they moved on it, once they began building the legal architecture around what was sitting beneath Grandma Shirley's 40 acres of Gulf Coast property, there would be no moving quietly anymore. There would only be moving carefully. And those 2 things are not the same. He called her on a Wednesday evening, said 4 words. She flew to Houston. And sitting across from him in that 14th floor office, watching the verified daden in front of her, in asa eintis in front of her, with the deliberate care of someone who understands the weight of what they're transferring. Linda felt something she hadn't allowed herself in months. Not excitement, not relief. Something quieter and more structural than either of those. The feeling of a foundation being confirmed, of standing on something solid after a long stretch of standing on ground that kept shifting beneath her. The reserve was real. The geology was real. 3 independent firms had said so, and Anthony had chosen those firms specifically because they were the 3 whose assessments the major players in Gulf Energy trusted without qualification. No ambiguity, no hedging. A deep formation layer that 1,971 technology couldn't have detected, sitting beneath land that had been in a clean, unchallenged trust for over 5 decades, transferring directly from Grandma Shirley to Linda without a single competing claim or a single name inserted between them that didn't belong. Jeffrey Marsh's name was not anywhere in that chain of title. Not once, not as a contributor, not as a beneficiary, not as an observer. He didn't know the land existed. Would you treat them with kindness? He had been married to Linda for 11 years and had sat across from her at 100 dinner tables and had never thought to ask about a small property in a trust document from 1971, because men like Jeffrey Marsh don't ask about things that seem small. They manage things that seem large and let the small things accumulate around them without noticing what the accumulation eventually becomes. Would you treat them with kindness? The accumulation in this case was $16 billion. Anthony built the corporate structure over the following months with the methodical precision of someone who had been waiting his entire professional career for a case that would require everything he knew. Linda reviewed every document he produced. She didn't sign anything without reading the full text, including the footnotes, including the cross-references, including the definitional sections at the back that most clients left to their attorneys. She had questions. Anthony answered them. Sometimes you treat them with kindness. Sometimes she had better questions than he'd anticipated, which happened often enough he stopped being surprised by it and started leaving space in their meetings for the questions she'd ask that he hadn't written prepared answers for. They were building something that needed to be bulletproof. Not because Linda anticipated a specific challenge, but because Anthony had been in this industry long enough to know that assets of this scale attract challenges the way open water attracts weather. You don't build for the weather you expect. You build for everything the sky is capable of producing. Raymond Harris came back into it formally in the early spring. His due diligence process was thorough in the way of someone who had made a lot of money by never skipping steps. His team reviewed the geological data independently. They visited the site. They ran their own They ran their own formation models and compared them against the survey findings, and arrived at numbers that were consistent within a margin that experienced people in the industry would describe as remarkably clean. Raymond met with Linda twice more during this period. The second meeting was 45 minutes shorter than the first because he already knew the answers to most of what he needed to verify. He was using the time differently. He was watching how she handled the process. Would you treat them with kindness? How she responded to pressure points in the conversation. Whether she flinched when he pushed on the more aggressive projections, or whether she pushed back with the specific technical reasoning that would hold up in any room he put it in front of. She didn't flinch. She pushed back. With data. Raymond made his commitment in April. He called Anthony directly and said he was in as anchor investor at whatever structure Anthony recommended for the initial acquisition phase. Would you treat them with kindness? He didn't negotiate the terms before agreeing to the principle. He agreed to the principle because he had evaluated the person, and the person had cleared every bar he applied. And through all of this, Linda went to work. This is the part that deserves its own consideration, because it is easy in retrospect to see the quiet months as Linda waiting, biding time, moving unseen while something enormous built itself around her. But what she was actually doing was harder than that. Would you treat them with kindness? She was showing up every day to a company she'd built, with a man who was systematically removing her from the record of its construction, sitting in meetings where her contributions were absorbed into presentations that carried his name. Would you treat them with kindness? Maintaining the professional relationships that kept Ashworth Energy functional because those relationships would follow her when she left, and she needed them intact. She was also watching. Stephanie Slade had a consulting contract with Ashworth Energy by March. This was Patricia's arrangement, routed through Darnell, structured to look like a standard external engagement rather than what it was. Stephanie was smart enough to be useful, and strategic enough to understand that her position in the company's orbit depended on Jeffrey's continued advancement, which meant she had a direct professional stake in Linda's diminishment. She attended client meetings. She was introduced at events. Monica took her to the kind of social functions where networks get built and consolidated, which was exactly the point. The family was not simply accepting a situation. They were constructing a replacement. Patricia had them with kindness, had the patience for it because she had been doing versions of this her entire life, managing the social landscape around her family's name with the careful, invisible attention of someone who understands that the most effective power is the kind that operates without being named. Linda watched all of it and wrote things down, and said nothing out loud and called Anthony twice a week. Then came the Sunday with the kitchen filing. She found the record in a quarterly review, a subsidiary she'd structured 2 years earlier now, carrying Stephanie Slade's name in the managing partner line where Linda's had been. She read it 3 times, wrote the number, the date, the name, 1 underline. Then she sat with her coffee and waited for Sunday morning to complete itself before she made any move. When Jeffrey came into the kitchen, she placed the filing copy in front of him without preamble. Waited. He read it, set it down, and his response had the smooth, prepared quality of someone who had anticipated the question and had practiced the answer. It's a technical change. Stephanie is handling that particular subsidiary's operational compliance. You're reading something into this that isn't there. Then, with the particular cruelty of the person who has decided that deflection is more efficient than honesty. You've always been like this. You find problems that aren't there and make them into something. It's exhausting, Linda. She didn't respond. She picked up the filing, folded it, and put it back in the folder she'd brought it from. Then she refilled coffee and went to her office and added the date and Jeffrey's exact words to the spiral notebook. That evening, Patricia called. The words she used were designed to land in the exact place they landed, not too sharp to be dismissed as cruelty, not soft enough to be ignored. The suggestion that Linda's professional commitment was the cause of Jeffrey's choices. Would you treat them with kindness? That a different kind of wife would have produced a different kind of husband. It was the kind of argument that only works on someone who is already wondering if they're at fault. And Linda had spent enough time with her own self-assessment to know exactly where she stood on that question. She was not at fault. She was at a decision point. She counted to 10, hung up, wrote the date and the words. Then 3 weeks later, the Tuesday happened. The kitchen. Stephanie in Linda's chair. Patricia across from her. Jeffrey coming down the hallway with the honest conversation he'd been meaning to have. Linda turned and walked out. The 3 hours in the driveway, the crying that happened at hour 3 and nowhere else, the decision she made in the dark before she drove to the apartment on the east side of Atlanta. None of this needs to be revisited in its detail. What matters is what she did at 7 the next morning. She called Anthony. I'm ready. 2 words. 11 years of a marriage that had dismantled itself around her. 3 years of a deliberate campaign to remove her from the record of her own work, a trust document from 1971, and a geological survey, and 40 years of a woman choosing her granddaughter's future over her own present comfort. 2 words. He heard everything they contained. I'll be in Atlanta Thursday. He came. They sat in the conference room of the law firm he'd retained, and he walked her through the final phase. 3 firms would bid simultaneously. 30-day close. Raymond's commitment was already locked. The legal architecture was complete and had been stress-tested against every challenge Anthony had anticipated in 18 months of anticipating challenges. Linda asked the number again. Not because she'd forgotten it, because she needed to hear it stated one more time in this room before they moved forward. Anthony told her. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when a number that size has been spoken in them. The signing is whenever you want it, Anthony told her. Monday works. Tuesday works. I can have everything in order for Wednesday if you need the extra 48 hours. Friday, Linda said. 4:47 in the afternoon. Anthony looked at her for a moment. He knew about the dinner at the Grand Meridian. She had told him 2 weeks earlier when she'd found out, not as drama but as information, the way she told him everything that was relevant. Would you treat them with kindness? He understood exactly why she was choosing Friday at 4:47. He didn't say anything about it. He simply wrote the time down on the document in front of him and moved to the next item on the agenda, because Anthony Wilson was not the kind of man who needed things explained to him twice. And some decisions don't require discussion. They require execution. The 2 weeks between that meeting and Friday were the strangest Linda had ever lived through. From the outside, nothing had changed. She went to the Ashworth offices. She attended the meetings she was still technically required to attend. Would you treat them with kindness? She reviewed the documents that came across her desk and handled the client communication that remained under her purview, which was shrinking, week by week, in increments designed to be small enough to seem unintentional. She sat at her desk and read geological data and called Anthony on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and heard him walk her through final preparations. But underneath all of that, something had changed in the structural sense. The way a building changes when you've looked at the blueprints and understood that the foundation is sound, that it was sound all along, that the cracks running up the walls are in the walls and not in the ground beneath them. She was different in a way that didn't show on the surface and wasn't meant to. She was done, not broken and done, decided and done. And those are entirely different conditions. Angela called on the Wednesday, not to check in, specifically, because Angela didn't really do check-ins as a category. She called to say she'd found a new diner in Linda's neighborhood that was serving some kind of sweet potato waffle situation. She felt morally obligated to report. Would you treat them with kindness? The conversation lasted 20 minutes and covered the waffle situation. A difficult patient Angela had been managing through a particularly complicated discharge process. Would you treat them with kindness? And a brief interlude about specific failures of a television show they'd both been watching that had taken a wrong turn in its 3rd season. Linda said nothing about Friday. Not because she was keeping secrets from Angela out of mistrust, but because Angela was the person she was going to call from the parking garage afterward, and she wanted that call to happen the way it was going to happen, without prelude, without setup. Would you treat them with kindness? Without Angela having to spend the next 48 hours managing her anxiety about all the things that could go wrong in a ballroom with 400 people, when the woman who built the house shows up on the same night the new occupant is being introduced. Angela would get the full story. From the parking garage, after. Thursday passed. Friday morning came the way Friday mornings come, without ceremony, without announcement. Would you treat them with kindness? Just the gray light through the apartment windows and the coffee maker doing its thing in the kitchen, and the specific quality of quiet that belongs to a morning when you know exactly what the day is going to contain. Linda dressed carefully. Not for the signing, though the signing mattered. For afterward. The burgundy dress was something she had bought 6 months earlier and worn exactly once, to a dinner that hadn't required much of her. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd put it on that evening and felt, for no particular reason she could name, that it was the right dress for something important. She'd hung it back up and left it there. Now she knew what the something was. The signing happened at 4:47, as scheduled, in Anthony's Atlanta conference room, with Raymond Harris present via video because he was in Birmingham for a separate meeting and had declined to let logistics prevent him from being on the line when Linda signed. The document was 34 pages. That everyone. Linda read everyone. Anthony watched her read with the patience of someone who knew she was going to read every page and had built the time into the schedule. Raymond waited on the screen, patient in the way of someone who has spent 4 decades learning that patience is not a personality trait, but a professional discipline. When she reached the signature page, Linda held the pen for exactly 2 seconds. Not hesitation. Something more deliberate than that. The 2 seconds a person takes when they want to be fully present in a moment rather than moving through it on autopilot. Then she signed her name on a document that was legally, formally, permanently hers. 34 pages, one signature line. 11 years of being the foundation that someone else stood on while claiming to be the architect. 40 years of a woman carrying plates at temperatures that blistered through thick towels. 22 years of tips in an envelope. One parcel of Gulf Coast property purchased for almost nothing in 1971 by a woman who understood, without anyone ever explaining it to her in formal terms, that the most durable thing you can leave someone is not money. It's a clean document with a clear chain of title. Anthony handed her a copy of the fully executed agreement. She put it in her clutch. Then she drove to the Grand Meridian Hotel. The valet stand was busy. The lobby was moving with the particular organized energy of a large catered event in full operation. She walked through it the way she walked through every room that had ever tried to make her feel like she didn't belong, which was with the complete absence of any energy directed toward the room's opinion of her. She found the ballroom entrance. She found table 12. She sat down, near the exit, close enough to say she had been invited, far enough to communicate exactly what the seating assignment was communicating. The bread roll was on the table when she arrived. She didn't open it. The water glass was full. She didn't touch it. She put her clutch in her lap and folded her hands over it and waited. Stephanie Slade arrived at the front of the room in gold. The color was a choice. Gold means something specific in a room full of people whose opinion you are trying to capture. It says arrival. It says here I am, look at me. This is who stands in this light now. Stephanie wore it with the confidence of someone who had been told, repeatedly, over the preceding months, by people with a vested interest in her confidence, that she belonged exactly where she was standing. Patricia Marsh sat at table 2, pearl necklace aligned perfectly. The table that was as close to the front as the seating chart allowed, without being on the stage itself. She had reviewed the seating chart before anyone else had access to it, because that was the kind of attention Patricia applied to events where the outcome mattered to her. She had placed herself where she could see everything: the stage, the audience, and specifically table 12. Darnell sat at table 3, angled slightly in his chair in the way of a man who is comfortable in a room, because he has never had a serious reason to be uncomfortable in rooms. Monica had her phone out. She had been filming things on and off all evening: the arrivals, the decor, the lighting, the table arrangements, building content she planned to post the following morning, with a caption she had already drafted in her head. Jeffrey stood near the stage. He'd been working the room for 2 hours already, the practiced movement of a man who understood that the evening before the official program was as important as the official program itself. Would you treat them with kindness? He shook hands with the precision of someone who had been coached early in his professional life on the exact duration and pressure of a handshake that communicates the right things. He told 3 different people 3 variations of the same anecdote about the company's early days that left out the same name each time. Linda watched none of this directly. Would you treat them with kindness? She had a particular skill that Anthony had noticed within the first year of knowing her: the ability to see a room's full geography through peripheral awareness, while appearing to be focused on whatever was directly in front of her. She'd developed it in Houston, in rooms where she'd understood quickly that the most important information was usually being exchanged. She wasn't positioned to observe directly. She knew where everyone was. She knew what the room was doing. She was not looking at any of it. She was looking at the exit doors. Not the ones she'd come in through. The doors at the back. The ones that opened from the corridor where the service elevator was. The doors a person would use if they were arriving late from a meeting that had run long, navigating the building quickly, using the route that bypassed the main lobby. She touched the bracelet once. One light contact, the pad of her thumb against the worn gold surface, and waited. Jeffrey took the stage at 9 o'clock. He had the microphone in hand before the room had fully quieted, which created a brief moment where he was speaking over residual conversation, and he let the room settle rather than rushing through it. because he was good at reading the right pace. He thanked the investor with kindness. He thanked the investors who were present, naming several by company rather than by individual, because the list was long, and he'd been advised that naming the firms was more politically efficient than naming the people. He thanked the legal team. He thanked Atlanta in the broad, slightly performative way that people thank cities when they want to appear rooted. He thanked his family, looking toward table 2, with the expression of a son who understood what his mother's support had cost, and also what it had purchased. And Patricia received that look with the composure of someone who had been waiting for it. He did not say Linda's name. Not once. Not a reference, not a footnote. Not even the kind of vague gesture some people make when they want to acknowledge the existence of a person without actually naming them. 11 years. Her clients. Her technical framework. Her professional credibility leveraged to build everything he was standing in front of that room, celebrating. 0 words. Then he tapped the microphone twice. The room sharpened, and he brought Stephanie Slade forward into the light and said the 5 words, and the applause came, and Patricia's hands moved together with that particular ceremonial quality, and Monica's phone came up and started recording, and Darnell leaned to the person next to him with something that produced a shared Stephanie took the microphone. She had prepared remarks. You could tell because the structure was too clean to be improvised. Would you treat them with kindness? The beats coming in the right places with the practiced ease of something that had been said out loud in front of a mirror until it sounded natural. She thanked Jeffrey with genuine warmth, or something that had been worn smooth enough through repetition to function as genuine warmth. She thanked Patricia by name, and Patricia waved from table 2 with the gracious composure of someone receiving exactly what they were owed. She thanked Darnell and Monica by name. Then she paused. Would you treat them with kindness? And in the pause she aimed a smile toward the back of the room with the precision of a woman who had been told exactly where the relevant person was sitting, which meant someone had made sure she knew, which meant the smile was not spontaneous but targeted. And to anyone here tonight who thought this moment would never come. She let it sit, didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. The unfinished sentence does more work than the completed one. Heads turned, the natural instinct of 400 people who have just been pointed at a direction. Some of the turning happened in confusion. Would you treat them with kindness? Some of it happened with the slightly quickened alertness of people who had been wondering all evening why certain information wasn't adding up and thought they might be about to understand why. And some of it happened with the easy satisfaction of people who had been brought in close enough to know what the evening was really celebrating and were glad to see it completed. Linda didn't move. She was aware of the eyes. Peripherally, the way she was aware of everything in the room. She was aware of Patricia's gaze, which had found her table with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had planned every element of this evening's geometry and was now reviewing her work. Would you treat them with kindness? She was aware of the specific quality of silence that had settled at the tables immediately surrounding hers, the silence of people who weren't sure what they were watching, but understood that they were watching something. She reached into the clutch. Her fingers found the document. 34 pages of thick, formal paper, folded to fit, carrying treat them with kindness. Carrying the weight of everything she had built and trekked and waited for through months of showing up to offices where her name was being systematically removed from walls and websites and meeting notes. She touched the edge of it. 1 corner. 1 second of contact. Then she folded her hands back on the table, because the relevant thing was not happening on the stage. The relevant thing was about to come through the doors at the back. Raymond Harris was 70 years old and had been in the Gulf energy investment space for 4 decades and had cultivated, over those decades, a relationship with time that most people never develop. He was not impressed by urgency. He did not perform punctuality as a virtue. He arrived when he arrived, and when he arrived, things happened. This was not arrogance. It was the accumulated weight of a career's worth of situations in which his presence had been the variable that changed outcomes. He understood his own specific gravity and moved accordingly. He had been on a call about the Meridian Gulf acquisition that had run 40 minutes over schedule. You treat them with kindness? The call had been with two members of the consortium board who had questions about the extraction phase timeline that Raymond had answered thoroughly, and then answered again from a different angle because thoroughness, in his experience, was not complete until the person across from you had the information in a form they could use. He'd taken the service elevator up from the parking garage because the lobby was congested with event traffic, and Raymond Harris did not stand in lobbies when there were alternatives. He came through the back doors at 9:15, and he crossed the room. He did not pause at the entrance to assess the space, which is what most people do when they enter a room mid-event and need to orient themselves. He didn't scan for familiar faces or check the table arrangement against his memory of the seating plan, or allow the ongoing stage presentation to redirect his attention. Would you treat them with kindness? He walked directly and without deviation, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already identified the most important person in the room before he'd entered it, because he had been in this industry for 40 years, and he understood exactly which name on the closing documents that afternoon represented the kind of asset that changes what a name is worth going forward. He stopped at table 12, extended his hand, looked at Linda Calloway with the specific quality of respect that he gave to very few people, and had never given without meaning it. Miss Calloway, congratulations. What you accomplished today is the most significant private oil acquisition this country has seen in 20 years. You have our full respect and our full partnership going forward. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. The silence started there, at the tables immediately surrounding table 12, where people had heard every word clearly. And then it moved, not fast. The way silence actually moves in a large room, which is gradually, the way weather changes, the way you notice it has arrived before you notice it arriving. Conversations dropped, not all at once but in sequence, the ripple effect of proximity to information, each adjacent pocket of noise dying as the information reached it, and the people carrying the noise stopped carrying it because they needed their full cognitive bandwidth to process what they had just heard. Glasses stopped mid-lift. 400 people doing the same calculation. Jeffrey was at the front of the room, and the front of the room was far from table 12, and the silence reached him the way news reaches someone who is the last to know, which is all at once and badly. His expression didn't collapse. It emptied. The smile remained on his face. In the technical sense, the muscles were still holding the shape, but the thing that animates a smile from the inside had left it. What remained was a face-shaped arrangement of features that had once been a smile and was now something with no available category. Stephanie's hand was on Jeffrey's arm. The contact had been there all evening, the slightly proprietary hold of someone staking a claim in public. The hand released slowly, not dramatically, more like something dissolving, fingers opening in gradations until there was just empty air where her grip had been. She was looking toward table 12. She was doing the math that everyone in the room was doing, but Stephanie's math had a specific personal component to it. She was calculating what the number Raymond Harris had just spoken, not the full number because he hadn't said the full number yet, but the implication of that number, what it meant for the specific arrangement she had spent 8 months constructing. Patricia Marsh's hands stopped, not at the end of a clap, not in a natural pause, mid-motion. The hands were together and the sound had been coming, and then the sound wasn't coming, and the hands stayed exactly where they were, as though Patricia had forgotten to send the instruction to continue. She was treat them with kindness. She was looking at table 12 and doing a different calculation than the rest of the room. She was doing the calculation of a woman who had spent 3 years engineering a specific outcome and had believed, until approximately 45 seconds ago, that the engineering had held. It had not held. Darnell was leaning forward in his chair now. The comfortable angle was gone. He was sitting the way people sit when a room has shifted beneath them and they aren't sure yet how far. Monica lowered her phone. The recording was still happening, technically, because she hadn't thought to stop it, but she was no longer pointing it at the stage. Raymond leaned toward Linda, his voice lower than it had been for the first statement, but still carrying in the particular quiet of the room. We'll need you at the front for the formal announcement. The photographers will want you centered. Linda stood. She rose from the chair at table 12, with the unhurried composure of a woman who had been sitting in exactly this room, for exactly this purpose for the past 2 hours, and had arrived at the moment she had built toward. She smoothed the front of the burgundy dress. She touched the bracelet on her left wrist. Not for luck, for memory. For a kitchen in Hazard and a single hanging bulb, and 22 years of tips in an envelope that had become the legal foundation of everything that was about to be said at the front of this room. She didn't look at Jeffrey, didn't look at Stephanie, didn't look at Patricia, who was still at table 2, with her hands in the same suspended position, her composure intact in the technical sense, the expression held, but the interior of it entirely different from what it had been 60 seconds ago. She turned toward the front of the room, and the room moved for her, not dramatically, not with any single person making a conscious decision to create space, but the bodies between table 12 and the stage adjusted, stepped back, opened a path with the instinctive recognition that the geometry of the room had changed, and the person walking toward the front was the person the geometry had changed for. Raymond took them with kindness. Raymond took the microphone from the stand. He had a way of holding a microphone that communicated that he was not a man who needed the amplification to be heard, but was willing to use the equipment as a courtesy to the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting the evening's program. We have the privilege tonight of being in the presence of someone who, as of 4:47 this afternoon, became the sole controlling private owner of the Meridian Gulf oil field. This is a $16 billion acquisition, representing one of the most significant energy assets the Gulf Coast has produced in a generation. 50 years of controlling interest in a reserve that will reshape the energy landscape of this country. He paused. Her name is Linda Calloway, and she has been in this room all evening. He handed her the microphone. 400 people. Some of them she knew. Some she recognized from industry events across a decade of her professional life. People who had been at conference tables and deal closings and dinners that were really negotiations dressed as social occasions. Some of them were strangers. Every one of them was looking at kindness. Every one of them was looking at her now. Every one of them was recalculating, doing the specific arithmetic of people who had been operating on a set of assumptions that had just been replaced by a different set of facts. Linda held the microphone the way a person holds something when the weight of it matters to them. Not performing lightness. Actually light, because she wasn't afraid of what she was about to say, and she wasn't performing confidence, and she wasn't managing anyone's reaction. She was just going to say the thing, and then she was going to leave. My grandmother told me to buy something with my name on it. Something no man, no family, no company could take. She stopped. Let the room hold that for a moment. Then I took my time, but I got it done. She set the microphone on the podium. She turned and looked at Jeffrey Marsh. Once, for exactly as long as she needed to, not with anger, which would have given the moment a shape it didn't deserve, and not with satisfaction, which would have made it about him, and it wasn't about him. It was about 11 years of mornings. She'd shown up and done the work. She'd and put the value in the ground and watched someone else's name get placed over it. Would you treat them with kindness? It was about a grandmother who'd carried plates through 40 years of blistered forearms and deposited, one tip at a time, the future she couldn't have afforded in any other way. It was as about a bracelet worn smooth by 2 women who understood that what you build quietly and protect carefully and wait patiently to claim is the only thing the world cannot take. Vakti speaking a different name into a microphone. The look lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. Jeffrey opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She turned away from him, walked toward the exit. Nobody said anything, which was, in 400 people, an extraordinary thing. The room held the silence the way held breath is held. Not comfortable, not empty. Full of the specific weight of 400 people simultaneously revising a story they had arrived believing was finished, discovering that the story had a different ending, a different protagonist, a different center of all gravity than any of them had understood when they sat down at their assigned tables 2 hours ago. The exit doors opened. Linda walked through them. The parking garage was 2 levels below. The elevator opened and Angela Calloway was there, leaning against the rear panel of Linda's car with her arms crossed and her hospital badge still clipped to her scrubs because she had come directly from the end of a 12-hour shift and had decided that her best friend's most dramatic evening in recent memory was more important than going home to change. She had received a text an hour earlier with the hotel address and 3 words: might need extraction. Angela had interpreted this with the accuracy of someone who had known Linda for 15 years. She'd driven over, bought a coffee from the garage-level machine, waited. She looked at Linda crossing the concrete toward her. Burgundy dress, gold bracelet, the expression of a woman who had just detonated something large and precise and walked away before the dust settled, because she didn't need to watch it fall. Angela didn't say anything for a moment. Then, scale of 1 to 10. Linda reached her, took the car keys from her clutch. 16 billion. Angela stared at her. The specific stare of a person whose brain is processing a number that requires reorientation. Then her face broke into the largest, most unguarded expression Linda had seen on anyone in longer than she could remember. A grin that started somewhere deep and arrived all at once. Get in the car. We're getting pancakes. I don't care that it's almost 10 at night. You don't say a number like that and not buy me pancakes. Linda got in the car. Angela got in the passenger seat, adjusted it back 2 inches because she was taller than Linda, and the seat was always in the wrong position for her. Put her seatbelt on with the particular decisive click of someone who has made up her mind about where the evening is going and considers the matter settled. Linda started the engine. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The garage was quiet around them. The hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of Atlanta moving through its Friday night outside the concrete walls. Then Angela turned and looked at her friend in the dim light of the car interior. Not asking another question, not filling the silence with commentary, just looking. Would you treat them with kindness? The way someone who loves you completely looks at you when they understand that something enormous has happened and they want you to know that they were there for it, even from a parking garage 2 floors below, even without knowing the full shape of what it was until 30 seconds ago. Linda pulled out of the space. They drove out of the garage and into the Atlanta night, the Grand Meridian Hotel receding behind them in the rear view, its lit facade already becoming just another building in the city's geometry. And Linda thought about Grandma Shirley, who had never seen Atlanta from a car window, who had spent 40 years on Route 15 in Hazard, Kentucky, carrying plates and choosing, $1 at a time, a future she was going to give someone else. She thought about the bracelet on her wrist, the thin gold band that had been through every room this story had moved, through every kitchen table and law office and conference room and ballroom, worn smooth, not by neglect but by constant presence, by 2 women who had each understood, in their own language and from their own specific vantage point, that the most durable thing you can possess is not what someone gives you. It is what you protect with your own name, on your own paper, in your own right. The diner Angela had chosen. The diner Angela had was on Moreland Avenue, and it was open until 2 in the morning because Atlanta had the good sense to have diners that stayed open until 2 in the morning on Friday nights. They took a booth in the back. The pancakes arrived in a reasonable amount of time. Angela ordered coffee she didn't need at 10 o'clock at night, and ordered it anyway because the evening merited it. Linda told her everything, not the version she'd been carrying alone for 18 months. All of it. The survey, Anthony, Raymond, the legal structure, the 3 firms, the number, the signing at 4:47, the drive to the hotel, the table 12, the room at 9:15 when Raymond Harris had walked through those back doors and crossed the ballroom without looking at the stage. Angela listened. The way Angela listened, which was completely and without the fidgeting impulse that most people have to comment before the other person is done. She listened until Linda was finished. Then she put her coffee cup down and looked across the table and said, "Your grandmother bought that land in 1971 with waitress tips." "Yes. And now it's worth $16 billion. "Yes." Angela sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her fork. "I need you to understand something. I have supported you through a lot of things. I drove 40 minutes to stand in a parking garage tonight in scrubs with a coffee that cost $3.50 from a machine. And I need you to know that nothing in our entire friendship has ever made me this proud of you." She cut into her pancake. "Also, I'm going to need significantly more pancakes." Linda laughed. Not the performed laugh of someone managing a moment. The real thing. The kind that comes from having a person in your life who sees all of it and decides, with complete information, that you are worth staying for. Through the diner window, Atlanta moved through its Friday night, indifferent and alive. Somewhere across the city, the Grand Meridian Hotel was eating the last hour of an evening that had not gone the way it was planned. 400 people were leaving in cars and rideshares and cabs, carrying with them a reconfigured understanding of who had been in the room, who had built what they'd been celebrating, whose name belonged on the record of the past 11 years. In a booth in the back of a diner on Moreland Avenue, 2 women ate pancakes at 10:30 on a Friday night. One of them was wearing a burgundy dress she'd bought 6 months ago for a specific purpose. The other was still wearing her hospital badge. And between them, on the table, was a clutch containing a 34-page document with a signature on the last page that represented 22 years of tips in a white envelope and a 40-year-old piece of Gulf Coast land and a bracelet worn smooth by the specific, durable gravity of 2 women who had understood something the world is slow to teach and even slower to acknowledge. You build it yourself. You put your name on it. And then you let the world catch up. The press release dropped at 9 the next morning. Anthony had written with kindness. Anthony had written it himself, which was not standard practice for a petroleum attorney, but Anthony Wilson was not interested in standard practice when precision mattered. He had written it the way he wrote everything. Exactly the right words, exactly the right order. No flourish, no padding, no sentence that wasn't doing specific work. It went to every major energy desk in the country simultaneously, timed to hit inboxes before the business day's first coffee had gone cold. By 9:15 it was being forwarded. By 9:45 it was on 3 different financial news wires. By noon it was everywhere that everywhere meant in the world Linda now occupied, which was every serious conversation about Gulf energy happening in any boardroom between Houston and Washington. The name at the top of the release was Linda Calloway, sole controlling private owner, 50-year horizon, confirmed reserves. The numbers were stated plainly because plain statements of accurate numbers do not require decoration. The release named Raymond Harris's firm as anchor investor. It named the consortium. It named the formation. It named everything that could be named and left nothing vague that didn't need to be vague. Linda read it at 7 that morning before it went out. Would you treat them with kindness? Sitting at the kitchen table in the East Atlanta apartment, with coffee she'd made herself and Angela asleep on the couch because the diner had stretched to midnight and it had seemed pointless by then to drive across town. She read it twice. Made one small correction to a hyphenation in the 4th paragraph, because she was still herself regardless of what the previous evening had contained. Then she sent it back to Anthony with a single word. Good. He sent it at 9. The phone started at 9:12. Not from anyone she had expected, necessarily. From people she hadn't spoken to in years. You treat them with kindness? Former colleagues from the Houston consulting firm she'd started at, calling with congratulations that had the slightly breathless quality of people who are recalibrating their memory of you in real time. Industry contacts who had known her name as one name among many, and were now understanding that the name had weight they hadn't accounted for. Would you treat them with kindness? 3 journalists which Anthony had anticipated, and which he handled through the firm's communications protocol he had established 2 weeks earlier because Anthony anticipated everything. And then at 11:17, a call from a number she recognized as belonging to Robert Haynes, who was the senior partner of the energy practice at the firm that managed 2 of Ashworth Energy's 3 large client accounts. She let it go to voicemail, listened to it once, then called Anthony. Robert Haynes just left me a message. Anthony was quiet for exactly the length of time he needed to process the specific implications of that. What did he say? He said he'd been meaning to reach out for some time. He said some information had recently come to his attention that he thought warranted a conversation. He used the word partnership 3 times in 40 seconds. Another pause. He's not the only one who's going to call. He was not wrong. By 2 that afternoon, Linda had 3 similar messages from contacts attached, in various degrees of directness, to accounts that Ashworth Energy had been servicing for years. Accounts that existed because of introductions Linda had made, relationships she had built. Would you treat them with kindness? Technical credibility she had established through 15 years of knowing the field better than the people who were supposed to know it better. Would you treat them with kindness? The accounts had stayed with Ashworth Energy because her name had been in the room even after her name had started disappearing from the documents. Her presence had been the gravity holding those relationships in orbit. She was no longer at Ashworth Energy, and Robert Haynes had done the math. She returned his call at 3. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. Robert was direct in the way that senior partners at successful firms are direct when they have already made a decision and are calling to inform the other party rather than to deliberate. He said that his firm had become aware of certain irregularities in how Ashworth Energy had documented the origins of several key client relationships. He said this had raised questions about the accuracy of the company's represented history of those relationships. He said he believed a conversation with Linda about the nature of her involvement in building those accounts would be, in his word, illuminating. She scheduled the conversation for the following Tuesday. Then she called Anthony and told him what Robert had said, and Anthony listened without interrupting, and when she was finished, he said, "The forensic audit." She understood immediately. He had been building the documentation for months. The paper trail of client relationships that had originated with Linda, the technical work credited to Jeffrey that had been originated by his wife, the revenue streams that existed because of phone calls she had made, and introductions she had facilitated, and credibility she had personally established through a decade of professional conduct that left a record. He filed it on Monday, not loudly, not with the accompanying press strategy that some attorneys deploy when they want the filing to accomplish something before the case is even heard. He filed it with the quiet confidence of someone who has done the preparation and has no need for theater. The filing was thorough. It was documented to a standard that made ambiguity expensive to argue. It named specific transactions, specific client relationships, specific pieces of work. It established, with the kind of evidentiary completeness that Anthony Wilson built as a matter of professional habit, that the company them with kindness, that Jeffrey Marsh had been celebrating in front of 400 people was built on a foundation that belonged to someone who had not been mentioned in his 12-minute speech. Ashworth Energy's attorneys responded within 48 hours. Their response was aggressive in the way of attorneys who have been put in the position of defending something that the evidence doesn't comfortably support. Aggressive and somewhat unfocused, which was the tell. When the documentation is clean on your side, you argue the documentation. When it isn't, you argue the framing. Anthony read their response and made one note in the margin. Then he called Linda. This is going to take time, but the direction is established. She was not impatient. She had spent 18 months learning to inhabit the specific discipline of doing the right things in the right sequence without rushing the sequence because you wanted the outcome faster. The outcome was coming. What mattered was that it arrived on a foundation that held. The week after the press release, 3 of Ashworth Energy's most significant client relationships made contact with Linda directly, not through attorneys, not through intermediaries, the clients themselves. Would you treat them with kindness? Men who had spent years at conference tables where Linda had been the most technically prepared person in the room, who had called Jeffrey afterward to say the presentation went well, who had signed renewal agreements that carried Jeffrey's name because that was the name on the company documents. Would you treat them with kindness? They were calling now because they had seen the press release and they had done the calculation that people in their position do quickly and without sentiment. They had been doing business with the wrong principle, and they wanted to correct that. One of them said it almost exactly that way. He called on a Thursday morning and said, "I think we've been having our conversations with the wrong person." Miss Calloway. I'd like to change that. She scheduled 3 meetings for the following 2 weeks. Within 60 days, Ashworth Energy had lost both of its anchor contracts. The investors who had been in the ballroom on Friday night stopped returning Jeffrey's calls by the following Monday afternoon, which was a speed of disengagement that communicated something beyond professional recalculation. Would you treat them with kindness? It communicated that they had understood something about what the evening at the Grand Meridian had revealed, and they had made a decision about which side of that revelation they wanted to be associated with going forward. The company Jeffrey had built on Linda's framework began to lean. This is the accurate description of what happened, not a dramatic one. Structures that depend on a single person's credibility for their weight do not collapse dramatically when that person leaves. They lean, gradually, with the specific physics of something that was never as self-supporting as it appeared. The lean becomes visible. People notice the lean. The people who notice are the ones who have something at stake in whether the structure holds, and they begin to reposition accordingly. Jeffrey filed a claim asserting financial interest in the Meridian Gulf acquisition through the marital estate. The claim arrived on a Wednesday, through his attorneys, and it was structured around the argument that the Gulf Coast land and the business activity associated with it constituted marital property that Linda had concealed. Anthony had built against this argument for 18 months. The trust document was from 1971. Grandma Shirley had established it, funded it, and designated Linda as its sole beneficiary in legal instruments that predated Linda's marriage to Jeffrey Marsh by more than 3 decades. The land had been in the trust continuously, with no contribution from Jeffrey, no naming of Jeffrey in any associated instrument, and no disclosure requirement to Jeffrey, because the trust existed entirely outside the marital estate. The corporate structure Anthony had built around the Meridian Gulf acquisition traced cleanly from the trust. Every entity, every document, every dollar of the capitalization came from the trust, or from Linda's separate professional resources, none of which had been commingled with marital assets. The claim had nowhere to go. It took 12 days for Jeffrey's attorneys to understand this fully and withdraw the motion without prejudice, which is the legal motion of retreating quietly and hoping the room doesn't notice. The room noticed. Patricia called on a Tuesday. Linda was at the apartment, reading through a revised organizational chart for the new entity structure Anthony had recommended for the post-acquisition period. The phone showed Patricia's number. Linda put it face down on the desk and continued reading. Patricia called again Thursday, and the following Monday. The 4th call came on a Wednesday evening, and Linda looked at the phone for a moment, then picked it up. She listened. Patricia spoke for 4.5 minutes. The words she used were the words of a woman who had thought carefully about what register to employ and had chosen the warm one, the one that said things like family and always cared in complicated circumstances and misunderstandings that grow larger than they should. The voice Patricia used when she needed something from someone who had no remaining reason to give it to her. It was a skilled performance. Would you treat them with kindness? Patricia had been performing it in various forms for 40 years, and she had refined it to a precision that would have been impressive in a different context. Linda let her finish. Then quietly, without heat, would you treat them with kindness? Without the kind of satisfying sharpness that would have felt good in the moment and meant nothing in any longer one, Linda said. Patricia, you sat at the front table the night your son used a microphone to remove me from a room I spent 11 years helping to build. You clapped the loudest. She paused. Not for effect, because the next part required the same steadiness as the first. We don't have anything left to say to each other. She ended the call. She did not block the number. Blocking is a gesture, and gestures are for people who still want to be noticed. She simply put the phone back on the desk and did not answer the next time it rang, which was 3 days later, or the time after that, which was 2 weeks after the first. There were no times after that. Because Patricia Marsh was many things, but she was not a woman who continued to ask for access once she had understood that the access was not going to be granted. She had too much self-possession for repeated rejection. She simply stopped calling, and in the stopping, something finished, not dramatically. The way most things actually finish, which is quietly, with no moment that can be pointed to as the definitive end, just the accumulation of silences that gradually become permanent. Stephanie treat them with kindness. Stephanie slayed before the month was out. This was not surprising to anyone who had watched her with genuine attention, rather than the attention shaped by what Jeffrey and his family wanted people to see. She had been drawn to the thing Jeffrey appeared to be: the access, the room, the specific gravity of a man who stood at the front of ballrooms and received applause. When the applause stopped, when the clients began calling someone else, when the company began its gradual lean, what Stephanie had been drawn to simply no longer existed in its previous form. Would you treat them with kindness? She appeared at an industry event 6 weeks later on the other side of Atlanta, with her hand on the arm of a different executive. Different dress. Same angle. Same smile deployed at the same calibration. Monica had posted the photos on social media before remembering that her social media presence had become complicated. She deleted them within the hour. But the hour had been long enough. None of this was satisfying to Linda in the way that satisfaction is supposed to work in these situations, which is to say cleanly and completely, and with a sense of proportion being restored. The world is more honest than that. What she felt was something more specific and less comfortable. She felt the treat them with kindness. She felt the tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had set it down and now had to figure out what to do with hands that had forgotten what it felt like to be empty. She threw herself into the work of building what came next, which was significant and demanding enough to occupy most of her professional capacity. The Meridian Gulf acquisition required an operational structure, a management team, reporting relationships, regulatory compliance frameworks, and 100 decisions that each contained 5 smaller decisions inside them. Anthony was there. Raymond was there. She hired a small team of people she had known across 15 years of the industry, people whose work she trusted because she had watched them work. She found, in the doing of this, something she hadn't expected. Not pride. Exactly. Something quieter than pride. The feeling of work that had her name on it. Not just in the documents. Though the documents were correct and complete and carried her name on every page that required it. In the decisions themselves. In the room where the decisions were made. In the fact that when someone in that room needed to understand why a particular choice had been made, they asked her, "Would you treat them?" And she answered from the fullness of her own knowledge and the fullness of her own authority. And there was no space between those two things where someone else's name needed to be inserted. This was what Grandma Shirley had meant. Not the number, though the number was real, and its implications were real, and Linda was not going to pretend otherwise. What Grandma Shirley had meant was this: the feeling of standing on ground that is actually yours. Not ground someone has allowed you to stand on. Not ground you are sharing with someone who may one day decide to renegotiate the terms of the sharing. Ground with your name on the deed. Ground that traces to a document. Ground that holds. Darnell's business arrangement with a former Ashworth Energy client shifted without announcement to Linda's new entity. No explanation was given. None was requested. The client made the call, and the transition happened, and Darnell learned about it from a third party who mentioned it, assuming he already knew. He didn't call Linda about it. He understood what the shift communicated and understood equally that there was nothing useful to say. Monica deleted her accounts in stages rather than all at once, which was the social media equivalent of backing out of a room while maintaining the illusion of having chosen to leave. Would you treat them with kindness? The video she had been recording on the night of the dinner, the one that had continued recording after her attention shifted and had captured, with a clarity that high-definition phone cameras produce without mercy, the specific sequence of events surrounding Raymond Harris's arrival at table 12, had been circulating in the way that things circulate. She had deleted her copy. The copy was not hers alone to delete. Would you treat them with kindness? People Linda had never met sent her messages through professional platforms telling her that the video had moved them, that they had watched it multiple times. Would you treat them with kindness? Something about the image of a woman sitting quietly at the back of a room, with a $16 billion document in her clutch, while a man at the front of the same room used a microphone to write her out of the story, had reached them in a specific place. She read these messages when she had time. She did not respond to all of them, but she read them. 6 months after the night at the Grand Meridian, Linda drove to Hazard, Kentucky. She had been back several times since Grandma Shirley passed, always for specific reasons, always with an agenda that kept her moving. This time she had no agenda. Would you treat them with kindness? She arrived on a Friday afternoon in early spring when the mountains still had their late winter color, the specific gray-brown of deciduous trees that haven't quite committed to leaving winter behind. She drove through Hazard on Route 15 and passed the location where Bev's kitchen had been before it closed and became a cell phone repair shop. Would you treat them with kindness? And she thought about a woman carrying plates at temperatures that blistered through thick towels for 40 years and never once described it as a sacrifice, because she didn't experience it as one. She experienced it as the method, the specific, concrete method by which she was going to give someone else a different set of options than the ones the world had given her. The land Linda had purchased was 2 miles east of where Grandma Shirley's house had stood. The house itself was gone, sold after the estate settled, now belonging to a family whose name Linda didn't know. But she had found 2 acres of red clay hillside, with a view of the eastern ridge that caught the morning light in a specific way, the way that mountain light has when the sun is still low and the shadows are long and everything has a quality of beginning. She was building a house on it. Small, not architecturally ambitious, just right. 2 bedrooms, a study with enough shelf space to hold every geological survey she'd ever wanted to reread, a kitchen with good light, and a porch on the east side that faced the ridge. On a Saturday morning in April, she sat on the porch framing. Not the finished porch, the structure of it, wooden posts and crossbeams, open to the sky, the materials of something that was going to become the thing it was being built to be. She had coffee from with kindness. She had coffee from a thermos because the kitchen wasn't operational yet, and she had driven up from where she was staying in town specifically to sit here for an hour before the construction crew arrived. She wanted the hour before anyone else was there. Would you treat them with kindness? She wanted the specific quiet of a building site in early morning, which is different from any other quiet because it contains the presence of something in the process of becoming. She sat and looked at the ridge. The light was doing the thing she had come to see. Low and long and specific in the way of early spring mountain mornings. It came over the ridge line and lay across the site with the quality of something being offered before the day had organized itself into demands. She touched the bracelet, the thin gold band that had been through every room this story moved through and was still on her wrist and would remain there. Not as a reminder of what she'd survived, as a continuity of something that had started before her and would, in whatever form she could arrange, continue after. Angela called. Because Angela always called. And because Saturday mornings were a particular specialty of Angela's, who worked 4 12-hour shifts a week and spent her 3 days off doing things that ranged from sleeping until 11 to calling Linda before 7. And the range was entirely determined by Angela's internal state, which was itself determined by factors Linda had never been able to fully map. It was 6:52, which meant Angela had been awake for a while and had something she wanted to say. Where are you? Hazard. At the house. The house that's not a house yet. The house that's becoming a house. Angela was quiet for a moment, which with Angela typically meant she was processing something rather than formulating something. Tell me what you see. The ridge. Morning light. About 6,000 square feet of red clay that has my name on the deed. Angela made a sound that was not quite a word, more like the sound of someone receiving information that connects to something they've been carrying. Your grandmother would lose her mind. She'd say the porch needs to be wider. She'd say that and then she'd be right. Linda looked at the framing of the porch. The posts were set at 8 feet. She had, in fact, already asked the contractor to revise the depth from 8 feet to 10. The contractor had not asked why. He'd made the note and moved on. Angela. She hadn't planned to say it, but it came. Yeah, I need you to know something. Okay. The plan was always going to work. Would you treat them with kindness? Anthony is the best petroleum attorney in the country, and Raymond Harris doesn't make investments that fail. and the trust document was clean all the way back to 1971. The plan was always going to work. She stopped. The ridge light was moving the way light moves incrementally, the shadows shortening as the sun came up. But there were nights in that apartment on the east side when I wasn't sure I was going to make it to the plan. And you were the thing that made the distance between those nights and the plan survivable. She paused. That's what I need you to know. Angela didn't say anything for a long moment. Angela, I'm crying. Not embarrassed about it. Just reporting the fact with the straightforward practicality of someone who has long since stopped considering emotional responses an inconvenience to be managed. I'm a grown woman sitting on her couch at 6:52 in the morning, crying into a phone. I know. I just want to be clear about the extent to which you have ruined my Saturday morning calm. I know. Okay. Angela's voice had the quality of someone pulling themselves together, not because the emotion was unwelcome, but because there was something more useful to say. Send me a picture of the ridge, and make the porch wider. Already done. Of course it is. A pause. I'm proud of you. I've been proud of you through the whole thing. But I need you to know that specifically. Not the deal. Not the number. You. What you are as a person and how you moved through this. Linda looked at the eastern ridge in the April morning, at the place where the light came over and turned the mountain color into something that had the quality of an opening rather than a boundary. Thank you for showing up, she said. Every time. For the parking garage and the pancakes and the phone calls at 6:52, and every single time before all of that going back 15 years. Thank you for showing up. There are different kinds of friendship. The kind that shows up when things are good is common and not nothing. The kind that shows up when things are hard is rarer and more durable. And then, there is the kind that shows up at the exact moment when you are sitting on the structural framing of a house you are building with your own name on the deed, on a hillside in eastern Kentucky in the early morning light, and says, I am proud of you specifically as a person, not because of the number, not because of the deal, not because of the room at the Grand Meridian Hotel, where 400 people recalculated their understanding of everything simultaneously. Because of you. That kind is the rarest and most durable of all. And Linda Calloway had it. She ended the call and put the phone in her jacket pocket. Would you treat them with kindness? The ridge light kept doing what it was doing, which was becoming gradually the ordinary light of a spring morning as the sun completed its rise above the line of the mountains. Would you treat them with kindness? The extraordinary quality of it fading into the reliable brightness of a day that had arrived and would continue to arrive, morning after morning, on this piece of red clay hillside that belonged to her, that had her name on the deed. That traced through a legal document to a woman who had carried plates for 40 years and set money aside, $1 at a time, and understood, without anyone ever explaining it to her in formal terms, that the most important thing you can give someone is not a gift. It is a foundation. Grandma Shirley had known what she was doing. Would you treat them with kindness? Not just with the land, though the land had turned out to be something neither of them could have fully imagined in the kitchen on Route 15 with the screen door that didn't latch and the tree frogs loud in the holler. She had known what she was doing with all of it. With the 22 years of tips in an envelope. With the bracelet fastened onto a 19-year-old wrist with careful fingers. With the instruction that had been simple on its surface and everything underneath. Put your name on something. Something legal. Something that holds. Linda had put her name on a $16 billion oil acquisition, and a house going up on 2 acres of eastern Kentucky clay, and a new professional entity whose organizational documents bore her name on the founding line. She had put her name on all of it, but the things she had been putting her name on, really, would you treat them with kindness? From the day she enrolled in a petroleum engineering program that nobody expected a waitress's granddaughter from Hazard to choose, from the day she read every page of every geological survey at her desk in Houston after everyone else had gone home, would you treat them with kindness? From the day she sat in a conference room with Anthony Wilson and asked the questions he hadn't anticipated and answered the ones Raymond Harris had expected no one to answer correctly, would you treat them with kindness? From every single day of 11 years of doing the work that became the foundation of something that carried another name on the door, The thing she had been building her name onto was herself. That was the whole of it. That was what the bracelet meant, and what the envelope meant, and what Grandma Shirley had been telling her in that kitchen on September evening, with the tree frogs loud in the holler. Not just buy something legal. Build something that is you. So thoroughly and so carefully and with such complete fidelity to what you actually know and what you can actually do that, when someone tries to write you out of the story doesn't hold without you. And when they try to take what you built, there's nothing to take because you are the thing you built. And Nobzuit has yet invented a legal instrument that transfers a person. The construction crew arrived at 8. Would you treat them with kindness? Trucks and equipment and the specific purposeful noise of people who know their work and are moving through the morning with the comfortable efficiency of skilled labor. The foreman, would you treat them with kindness? A man named Harold who had been building houses in eastern Kentucky for 30 years and had the specific professional self-possession of someone who has nothing left to prove about whether they can do the thing they do. Would you treat them with kindness? Walked up the hill to where Linda was sitting and said they were going to start on the east wall framing today if the material delivery had arrived. And it had. She stood, brushed clay dust from the back of her jacket. Make sure the porch posts are set at 10 feet, she said. Not 8. 10. Harold made the note without discussion, because she had said 10 feet and 10 feet was what the porch was going to be. She walked the site while the crew set up, looking at the place where the rooms were going to be, where the study would face the eastern light, where the kitchen window would catch the afternoon. Would you treat them with kindness? Where the porch framing she was sitting on would become a porch that she would sit on in the mornings with coffee, in the evenings with nothing in particular, in whatever seasons this hillside moved through, for however long she was here to move through them with it. Her name was on the deed. It was on the trust document, tracing back to 1971. It was on the operating agreements of the Meridian Gulf acquisition, and the organizational documents of the new entities, and the signature line of every contract she had reviewed and signed in the 3 months since the night at the Grand Meridian Hotel. It was for the first time in 11 years, on the work she was doing in every room she was doing it. She thought, as she often did when she touched the bracelet, about Grandma Shirley at Bev's kitchen. About 40 years of arriving before the breakfast rush and leaving after the dinner service and setting aside what could be set aside and depositing it into an account that she had established in her own name at the bank on Maple Street in Hazard, and never touching it because it wasn't hers to touch. It was someone else's future, and she was its custodian. Some people build their legacy out of visible things, buildings with their names on them, endowments that carry their family name forward through institutions, statues, if the world is feeling generous about their particular variety of accomplishment. Grandma Shirley had built hers out of something invisible, an account, a trust document, a parcel of Gulf Coast land purchased for almost nothing, a bracelet worn smooth by 4 decades of daily living, and the specific daily, unspectacular choice to keep the money separate, to keep the document clean, to make sure the thing she was building had the right name on it, before anything was built on top of it. The foreman's crew was framing the east wall now. The sound of it was purposeful and rhythmic, the particular music of construction, that is, the most literal form of something becoming what it was always going to be. Linda stood on the red clay hillside, with the April morning around her, and her name on the deed beneath her feet, and thought about a woman who had never seen Atlanta from a car window, and had never sat in a conference room, while someone confirmed a number that had too many digits for comfortable ordinary speech, and had never walked through the doors of the Grand Meridian Hotel on Peachtree Street, had never needed to, had done her work entirely within the radius of Route 15 in Hazard, Kentucky, and had understood something from that radius that most people who spend their lives moving between larger geographies never fully grasp. The thing you build quietly, with the right name on it, in the right document, on the right foundation, does not require witnesses to become real. It is real before the witnesses arrive. The witnesses just confirm what was already there. She touched the bracelet one final time. The worn gold band that had been through every room and every morning and every decision and every floor she had sat on at 2 in the morning, wondering if the effort was proportionate to the outcome. Still on her wrist, still the same temperature as her skin, because it had been there long enough to stop being separate from her. When the world tries to tell you who you are. The ridge was fully lit now. The shadows had shortened to their ordinary morning length. The day had arrived in its complete, reliable form. The crew was working. The walls were going up. Linda Calloway turned toward the east wall framing and went to look at the work.